Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to take a look at how we can refute the black lion under certain conditions. I will be playing white, and the game starts out with d4, d6, e4, now knight to d7, knight to f3, e5, and bishop to c4. And finally, the black line is completed on the board. Knight g to f6. And if black chooses to play the black line this way, I think it's safe to say he's as good as lost, because he doesn't understand the opening very well. Now, first let's take a look at the proper development of the black line, and then we can point out the difference. A good development of the black line is d4, d6, e4, and now knight to f6. And what this move does is immediately attack the pawn on e4. This of course forces a response. Knight to c3. Now knight to d7, bishop to c4, and e5, and this is the proper development of a black line system. And we note the difference with the previous game. In this game I was forced to develop the knight on c3, and there is no knight development on f3. So let's go back to the original game. Like this. One may think the advantage white has is he can now immediately go for the knight jump, attacking the weak pawn on f7. However, if this were to be played, it's a little premature, because after knight to g5, black can still acknowledge he made a mistake and recover, and play d5, which I'm forced to respond to, because I'm being attacked with the pawn. And even though black will gambit the pawn, his play is still very strong, so this is not the correct continuation for white. So instead of the knight jump, what white should do is simply continue with the opening attack. Pawn takes pawn. And there are a few ways black can respond to this. Of course he has to, because his knight is under attack. He can either go pawn takes pawn, after which I can play the knight jump, and we see there's no longer a pawn available to block this threat. This will result either in bishop to b4 check, allowing black to castle with tempo in order to protect the pawn. Of course, after c3 he will lose the minor piece, or he can play something else like b6 and suffer the fork, knight takes pawn on f7, after which he will lose probably the rook. So pawn takes pawn is a bad move. Alternatively, the knight can take on the pawn on e4, knight takes pawn. Now queen to d5, and we can see another problem for black, threatening the checkmate. If queen to e7, black will lose the knight. So this cannot be played. Let's go back. So pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn on e5 is a bad move. Knight takes pawn on e4 is a bad move. Perhaps black may try the d5 move, still hoping to protect against threats on f7 after the knight jump. But after pawn takes pawn, knight to g4 trying to counterattack, perhaps queen to e2, adding a second defender, black will simply be down 2 pawns. So that's not a good idea either. The move that was played after pawn takes pawn was knight takes pawn on e5. Play continues with knight takes knight. Of course, knight recaptures, and black still hopes to get away with perhaps trading off queens and losing a pawn, after which black will be down a pawn, but he may recover one pawn on e4, and I don't want to let this happen. So the correct attack continuation is through a bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes pawn on f7, check. If say king to e7, now we can play queen takes, king recaptures, and we have the possibility to play f3. So we will be up one pawn. The king has moved, and it will be difficult to defend the isolated pawn, and this is clearly winning for black. Alternatively, black of course can recapture the bishop, and this was played. King takes bishop, threatening queen takes queen, so the queen will be lost. Queen takes, and now bishop to b4 check with the discovered attack on the queen. And of course after the move c3, this minor piece will be lost. Rook takes queen, pawn takes bishop, and now we will lose this pawn. And this is not the best continuation. What white should do instead, which was played, after king takes bishop, queen takes queen, bishop to b4 check, threatening to recapture the queen. The correct move is queen to d2, using the queen, which is already lost, to protect against the check. Of course, black is forced to recapture the queen. And the final move, knight takes bishop on d2. And the difference is, after the exchange has been performed in this way, we have developed our knight in order to defend the pawn on e4. So black will be down the pawn. Furthermore, his king can no longer castle. He has an isolated pawn, and this pawn is on a black colored square, and he no longer has the black colored bishop. In the end, it will be impossible for black to defend this pawn. So rook to e8 in order to try and defend. I play f3, getting ready to castle, but first developing the pawn on e3, which frees up the knight. And white shouldn't be scared of the open diagonal, because black doesn't have a black color squared bishop. g5, a4, covering the square on b5, and now this bishop has limited mobility. Bishop to d7, b3, preparing to fianchetto and start attacking the pawn on e5, h5, going for some sort of pawn storm. I castle, rook a to d8, bishop to b2, so you're seeing our first attacker being developed. Bishop to c6, knight to c4, so we are seeing our second attacker. Knight to d7, defending. Rook 8 to D1, Rook to the open file, and King to E6, using the King to defend the pawn instead of the Rook, which will now have to be used in order to protect the Rook on D7 after the knight moves. Rook to D2, looking to form a battery. And now King to E7 to protect the Rook on D8. And the reason why this has to be played is if a random move is played at this point, say A6, Rook F to D1, H4, another random move, the game may now continue with knight takes pawn, knight recaptures, rook takes rook, rook recaptures, rook takes rook. So the rook on d8 has also become under attack. So a random move cannot be played. Instead, black is forced to abandon the pawn. It can no longer be defended. And he plays king to e7. I double up on the rooks. And now a6. There are no more moves for black to play. I grab the pawn. Knight recaptures. Knight takes knight. Rook takes rook. Rook recaptures. So the central pawn of black has now become lost. So we continue the game and win by force. King to e6 in order to attack the knight. Of course, there is no room for the bishop to flee to. So I will take it out and double the pawns. Knight takes bishop. Pawn recaptures. King to f2, so it's time for the king to step up. h4, h3, rook to g8, g3, moving things along and starting to exchange pawns. Pawn takes pawn, king recaptures, a5, rook to d3, rook to b8, king to g4, already threatening the pawn on g5, rook to h8, trying to counterattack rook takes pawn, rook to c3, king to d6, and now I'm going to start sacrifice a few pawns to move the game along. e5 check, and now the king has become overloaded. King takes pawn, rook recaptures, threatening this pawn and both other pawns with the discovered attack. Rook to h7, check, king to d4, I grab the a pawn. c5, hoping to lock the rook in, but I sacrifice another pawn with c3. King takes pawn, rook recaptures, check. King takes pawn, and we can start pushing the a pawn. a5, king to b4, I grab the final pawn. And now it's just a matter of promotion. Sacrificing a pawn to move things along. And black will be mated in a few more moves. So that was a game against an opponent who played the black lion but didn't understand what the moves were all about. And of course, mistakes like that have to be punished, but you have to know how to do it. So I hope you learned a thing or two about the black lion and the opening. Thanks for watching and have a great evening. So the correct attack continuation is we have developed our knight in order to we have developed the knight in order to defend the pawn on e4. And of course, mistakes like that have to be punished. And of course, mistakes like that have to be punished. And of course, mistakes like that have to be punished. But you have to know how to do it.